Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today's video is called Cut in Two, the murder of Elizabeth Short, also known as the Black Dahlia. This video is comprised of newspaper articles. I've trawled through all the newspapers that I could find. I also am using the FBI's release documents from the FOIA requests, as well as the documents also released through FOIA from the LAPD. So if you see anything you haven't seen before, that is why. In part one of this series, we're going to focus on the early life of Elizabeth Short before it was essentially cut in two when she was murdered. But before then, she was known as Betty Short or Beth Short, and that's what we're going to look at today. Elizabeth Betty Short was born on July 29th, 1924 in Hyde Park, Massachusetts. Her father was Cleo Short, her mother Phoebe Short, and she was the third of 5 girls. Her sisters were Eleanor, Noni, Muriel, Virginia, and Dorothea. So as this clipping notes that she was generally known as Betty, although she preferred to be called Beth. And she was attractive and, like most children of her time, movie-struck. Beth's father, Cleo, had built miniature golf courses, and by 1930, Cleo, this fine specimen of a father, abandoned the family after the Great Depression, so Betty was about 6 years old. Cleo left his automobile at a Charleston parking space. A very worried Phoebe Short called the police in order to search for her husband, but he just went missing and was thought to have committed suicide. And Cleo later, many years later, surfaced and defended his actions, citing that when he had left the family that he'd provided a trust fund for their support. But yeah, he wasn't exactly welcomed back with open arms. So here's a picture of Beth Short, the face of a child that essentially was abandoned by her father along with her sisters and her mother. How someone could abandon that cute little face is beyond me. Phoebe Short had to work very hard to support the 5 girls and herself in light of Cleo's disappearance. So once Cleo dipped out on the family, Phoebe went to work as a bookkeeper. Betty, or Beth, was pretty even in school. Her friends and acquaintances called her Medford's Deanna Durbin, after the popular singer of the day. Beth was known to be shy and retiring, and she was often sick with asthma and lung problems, and so she was sent to the hotter climates of Florida in order to survive the winters because it was just way too cold in Massachusetts. So it's believed that she started going to Florida by 1940 when she was only 16 years old. And I posit that perhaps Beth began to be accustomed to kind of bouncing around away from her family because of this condition. And as this snippet notes that from the age of 10 on, she suffered from asthma. She finally developed a serious lung condition and underwent I think it's emphysema operation. I also want to note that you will see the evidence of that in her autopsy. Or should I say, autopsy notes. And here's a snippet, a clipping from one of her high school chums, and said, of course I haven't seen her for the last 3 or 4 years, but in high school, she was a really beautiful girl, and they all used to say she looked like Deanna Durbin. She was very popular, and I've known her since I was a baby. And her sister Dorothea is one of my best friends. A neighbor of the Shorts remembered in this clipping that Elizabeth was, quote, crazy about clothes and, quote, seemed to be a nice girl. So it was common for Beth to come to Florida during the cold winters and enjoy places like Jacksonville and Miami. And of course, she got to meet a lot of eligible young men. She was still a teenager. And on this occasion, she was down in Florida, and that's when she met what she said was the love of her life, Major Matt Gordon Jr. in Miami, but he was soon to be stationed overseas. Without a doubt, the type of man that Beth Short preferred was a man in uniform, and Major Matt Gordon fit the bill. And they proceeded to write each other back and forth when he was stationed overseas, but that did not stop her from going out and having dates with other people. I'd like to correct the record about people that go on and on about Beth being so starstruck that that's all she wanted in life was to be a movie star. Beth went to California first to be with her father, Cleo, then because of the suitable weather for her body, and finally due to the lure of Hollywood, just being in bit parts and the like. So I just want to note that being in Hollywood, to be a humongous star was not her singular dream. And that's also borne out by what she did while she was there. She dated men in uniform. Beth reconnects with her father, Cleo. And her oldest sister, Virginia, had already gone to California first to visit the father. And Virginia married Adrian P. West while she was there. So her sister lived in California. So in 1943, Cleo sent Betty, or Beth, $200 to come to California from Florida. And she went to live with her father, first near the University of California in Vallejo, but it didn't work out because he expected his daughter to stay at home and to do housekeeping for him. I kid you not, okay? She's a teenager. So Cleo said that she came, but she spent all of her time, quote unquote, running around instead of keeping house for him. Quote, I made her leave, he added bluntly. In January 1943, he essentially kicked her out for not cooking, cleaning, and for going out, dating men or just going out. So her father said this, quote, I told her to go her way and I would go mine. She wouldn't stay home. Now, mind you, the statements I just gave you, he made these statements after he knew his own daughter was dead. This is the kind of a father that poor Beth Short had. So in 1943, after a very short visit with Pops, and Beth gets the boot from her dad, she goes to waitress at an Army base Camp Cook, that's now known as Vandenberg Air Force Base near Santa Barbara. So her former boss, Mrs. Inez Keeling, at this point Betty was working at the post exchange at Camp Cook, and Miss Keeling said that she was shy and bashful at first and she didn't date the soldiers initially, and that she was a model employee in all the respects, not smoking and seldom drinking, which, just as a side note, that was her behavior. She wasn't a smoker and she very seldom drank. But then a few months later, she began to go out with the soldiers several times a week. In this picture, the label has the name spelled incorrectly and the date is 1943. And this is a picture of the Camp Cuties, and Elizabeth Short is right in the middle with the braids on the side of her head and the hair almost like a turban. Just note for later that a sergeant, Mary Stratter, befriended Beth when they both worked at Camp Cook, and where Mary said that Beth lived with a sergeant who threatened her life. So this is something to also keep in mind for later when things go awry, to try to figure out who could be a suspect. And then in, I think it's late 1943, early 1944, Beth was cavorting with some soldiers who were drinking. And she was arrested. She was 19, but the drinking age, I think, was 20 or 21. And so she was sent back to Massachusetts by the juvenile authorities. And so hence this mugshot you see here. The charge that she got was being a minor illegally in a bar. And Mary Unkeffer of the Santa Barbara Police Department was the one that arrested Betty. And Mary Unkeffer later noted that, quote, she had the blackest hair I ever saw. So after being arrested and being sent on a train back home to Massachusetts, Betty didn't stay there long, or Beth didn't stay there long. She ended up going back to Florida. Then she'd go back to California, and she was having romantic, emotional attachments to different men that she was dating. Primarily still Matt Gordon, and also a Lieutenant Joseph Gordon Fickling. On August 10th, 1945, Beth lost her then fiancé, Major Matthew Gordon, who'd been killed in a plane crash. He was an Army pilot who was doing maneuvers, and he was credited with downing 7 enemy aircraft when he was shot down over India. He was testing a repaired plane and trying to locate a downed pilot, and his plane hit a tree. He wasn't immediately killed. I think he died at the hospital. But regardless, he had promised to marry Beth, and allegedly When Beth was notified by Matt's own mother of his death, Beth then wrote one of Matt's friends asking for the engagement ring that the friend was allegedly holding for Matt Gordon's return. And he was going to give it to Betty, but it never happened because sadly he passed away. In retrospect, we'll never know how truly serious the relationship was, because she did date other men while he was stationed overseas, like Lieutenant Fickling. But in retrospect, the relationship was serious enough to Beth that she mentioned it to everyone. She had numerous friends like Lynn Martin, Marjorie Graham. That was a girl she'd known from back home and who was later her roommate at one point in California, a woman named Ann Toth. And Beth would go on to her friends like Dorothy French, that she had loved Matt Gordon, that they'd been married. She kind of then began to fantasize. It seems at this point she's starting to fantasize a little bit in her stories, and she would tell friends that she had been married to Matt Gordon and that they even had been husband and wife and had a baby, and that the baby had passed. Depended on who it was and what the situation was, that the story would kind of evolve. And it just seemed like she commonly fantasized about what she wanted her life to be, and then she just sort of fibbed to people. This is what Beth looked like when she lived in California. She has an open face, really friendly looking. She has a very high hairline. It's even noted in the autopsy notes about how high her forehead was. She commonly styled her hair with a forelock, like a curl in the middle of her forehead, perhaps in a way to kind of disguise all that forehead. I can understand. I have a high forehead as well. Her hair was like a dark crown that just framed her whole face. And you'll see this throughout all her photos, especially the ones that I'm showing here. It's like a turban or a crown. And then she would accent it with a flower, sometimes on one side, sometimes on both sides. She wore pumps, she wore furs, she wore earrings, she wore tailored suits. She was always turned out nicely. So this is part one of the history of how Elizabeth Short got to be in California, where she met her fate. This little clipping you'll see here was one of the first clippings after her body was identified, and initially it was called the werewolf murder, but then after this it was a Long Beach druggist who introduced Beth Short's nickname into the case, because she used to go into the drugstore frequently. She'd usually wear a black two-piece beach costume because it was the summertime and it left her midriff bare, and she'd wear black lacy things. Her hair was jet black, and she was real popular with the men that came in there, and they got to calling her the Black Dahlia. And then later on in the story, I'll tell you how a journalist overhears this, calls it in, and says, "Oh, she's the Black Dahlia. It's not the werewolf murder." That's all everybody remembers her as. But truly, before she was cut in two, she was Beth Short. Elizabeth Beth Short. So I hope you enjoyed. This is part one of the backstory of Beth Short. Part two will consist of the timeline leading up to her death, and then she will be cut in two. Essentially, it's almost like she becomes the Black Dahlia. If you like this video, please press the like and please subscribe. I appreciate it so very much. And thank you so much for watching.